Hey there. Today I wanted to talk about sus chords. What are sus chords? How can you, what do you play over them? How can you kind of treat them? And I also want to talk about the tune or the composition Maiden Voyage by Herbie Hancock, which is a composition that has a whole bunch of sus chords in it. So I think it would be the best example of a famous tune that uses sus chords. So I think most people that follow my channel know what a sus chord is, and but it's still there's a lot of things to be said about this sound. So Maiden Voyage starts with a D sus chord. So we want to separate this kind of sus chord from regular traditional music or classical music. A sus chord is just suspended third, right? So it's a sus 4 that usually resolves. But jazz players, for some reason, think of sus chord as something else. It's a sound that you create from the fifth degree of a scale. So D sus would be the fifth degree of G major, and on the fifth degree of G major we find a dominant chord. But at closer inspection you realize that you can also create a sus chord, which means you can use all the notes from Mixolydian scale, but you need the fourth degree in there. When you play regular D7 Mixolydian, the fourth degree is what's called an avoid note. But if you think of it as a sus chord, it's not an avoid note. Plus, we're playing Maiden Voyage, which is a modal tune, which means that we can use all the notes. But you need that fourth degree in there. So you can think of it as a C triad over D. You can think of it as an A minor triad, A minor 7. Sorry, an A minor 7 chord over D, or an A minor triad. A minor 7 over D. C major 7 over D. That's a C major 7 chord over D, right? These are all different variations of a D sus. You can even throw in that F sharp. As long as you have the G natural in there too. Otherwise, it's not a sus chord. So any kind of C Lydian chord over D. Or any kind of C Lydian chord that has a G in it, I should say. In the first A section of Maiden Voyage, you have two sus chords, D sus and F sus. And this tune is all about this specific rhythm. Not only is it about the sus chords, it has this rhythm. Right? So you want to be able to play that rhythm, but when you're actually performing the song with the band, you don't want to be too locked into this rhythm, but you still want to be able to play that rhythm with no problem. But when you listen to the actual recording, which is a fantastic recording, you hear how they kind of go in and out of that rhythm, and they eventually leave it. So, but you still need to be able to play that rhythm without problems. So what you can do is you make a little vamp of the A section of the tune. So D sus to F. But here's the thing, I like to think of these chords as minor chords. So I think of the first chord as A minor rather than D sus. And as I said before, they're pretty much the same thing except for the bass note. But we guitar players don't care too much. Sorry, bass players. But we don't care too much about the bass note. So you can play A minor And then I try to hint at that rhythm, but I don't want to be too rigid about it. I just want to, how should I put it? I want you to hear that rhythm, but I don't want to play it like, so something like, and C minor. So even though I'm not playing the right bass notes, it doesn't really matter to me. It's still the same sound, and I can kind of hear the bass there. Even though it's not there, I can still kind of imagine it. So if I make a little loop, so I guess I could add some bass to the mix. Okay, now that I have a little backing track that I created for myself, I would just recommend start playing the Mixolydian scale. So now there are no void notes, so you can just play any note pretty much, and just noodle around and see what happens. Okay, so what you want to avoid here if you're a beginner is you don't want to be like playing something here and then moving it here. You want to be able to switch anywhere. So one exercise you can do is play on one string and just play half notes. Starting on the lowest, you can go on that string. So the first note I could play from the D mixo scale on the E string is E, right? So half notes. And then switch to the next scale. Just playing on one string, but maybe that's too easy for you, but that's a good way to learn how to make that transition, right, to the next mode without stopping your idea. You want to be able to continue regardless of what the next chord is. This is something that also that Scott Henderson talked about a lot. And I remember one thing that he told us was that, let's say you're doing that, you're playing that scale. And now the next chord is coming up, and your brain can't think fast enough, like, wait, what is the next note of the next scale that I'm supposed to go to? Well, it's F, which is the second degree of the, no, sorry, it's the root of F Mixolydian. So then, let's say you can't think of that fast enough. What you want to do is you want to stop, think about it, figure it out, go back and do the exercise again. And that's how you practice, because then you're actually improving. You're teaching yourself to you're fixing your mistakes, I guess. So then at the end of the day, ultimately, you don't want to be able to have any problems doing this. It should be just be effortless to move in and out of these two chords, right? So other things you can do is, well, this is kind of an example of somebody who is kind of new to jazz improvisation. They would do this. They would just kind of play the scale and noodle. That's not how a seasoned player does it. You want to be able to play more interesting intervals and harmonic content that is has more variation to it, not just half steps and whole steps. So experimenting with intervals, right? Like maybe, I don't know, fifths. Right? That would be an example of more intervallic playing. So something interesting happened here too. I was playing this interval, D to A, over the D sus. And it was time to switch to F sus. The thing is, those two notes are also in the F Mixolydian scale. So some notes are gonna be the same. Some notes are gonna be the same. Actually, there are more common tones, I think, than notes that are changing, because between those two scales. So the only notes that changes are B to B flat, what else? F sharp to F, and E to E flat. If I'm not mistaken, that's so there actually it's easier to think about the common notes. Right? You can also play arpeggios. All those chords I mentioned in the beginning could also be arpeggios. So C major 7. E flat major 7. Same thing here. You don't want to be just kind of moving the same shapes. You might want to be able to find the closest next arpeggio in the same position, right? You could play pentatonics, so A minor pentatonic to C minor pentatonic. Same thing, you don't want to be just playing. You want to continue with the same shape or the same position that you started. So again, we don't want to be playing pentatonics like blues guitar players. It's not what we're doing here. We're more of this kind of pentatonic playing. Let's say I play that pattern, so 1/4 up and then down, up, down. That's an idea, right? It's the audience hears that it's a shape that has a contour to it, and then you want to continue with the same shape, the same position for the next scale, C minor. So if I experiment with that. Same thing like here, the C and G, the same for both. So that's a, what do you call it, pivot place that you can take advantage of when you're playing. So this is a modal tune, modal jazz. Another thing I should mention is that the idea of this album, there's a theme, which is the ocean. So this is a great example of a tune that is not just a modal exercise, because a lot of jazz sometimes it sounds like somebody just came up with an idea, concept, but it's just based on theory, doesn't have any artistic element to it. But this is a great example, because when I think of this tune, the recording, when I can hear it in my head now, if I want to, it's such a strong artistic statement that it sounds like the ocean, or I don't know, boats. Right? It's amazing. Apparently he was only 24 when he recorded this album, so that's pretty crazy. And there's some great musicians on it, and yeah, it's, if you haven't heard that album, you definitely need to check it out. It's such a milestone in jazz history and modal jazz. So modal jazz, we could actually think of, it opens up to a more chordal harmony approach. So instead of playing third based chords, play fourth-based chords. So if I stack fourths from the D, that's a G, C, F sharp. That's a sus chord right there. Then I just harmonize the scale, I go up the scale. Do the same with the F sus. Right? So if you thought that exercise in the beginning was too easy with just playing half notes, do the same thing with these chords. So you could also do fourths in your soloing, right? What am I doing? Right, so that's a more modern approach, but it's still today this is pretty old, and a lot of players these days think that that kind of playing is even kind of lame and outdated. But it's a phase you need to go through if you haven't already, is to go through the fourth phase, playing fourths. McCoy Tyner obviously comes to mind, is the master of the fourth voicing, I guess. So that has more modal, meaning that the chord doesn't have a function in the same with a dominant chord. It's a functioning chord that wants to go somewhere. But this it's more colorful, you know. You just kind of imagine the mode is like you're painting with, instead of playing chords that wants to resolve, or it's just like it's a more impressionistic approach. Then the tune, the B section, we have E flat, sus, or B flat minor to C sharp minor, which could be, you could think of it as an F sharp sus, right? But for some reason it's C sharp minor there, and maybe he thought of that as, you know, he doesn't, instead of just using sus chords, he wanted something else for variation. Or maybe Ron Carter just felt like playing C sharp there, or maybe they didn't even think about any of that stuff. It's just, those were the chords that he heard. Who knows? What happens though with a lot of my students when this is a good tune to introduce, you know, somebody who's kind of new to jazz. What happens a lot of times is that they're playing over the first A section, no problem, and then when the B section arrives, the E flat sus and C sharp minor, all of a sudden they're confused because they're not as strong with those modes, and they're also not sure where they are in the form. So this is a good tune to learn how to really hear when the form starts over. You need to play A, B, A, and then remind yourself, here is where the form starts over, so that you don't get confused. And also, if you can hear which mode you should be able to hear it, because if you're playing and you think that it's D sus, but someone else is playing E flat sus, and you're not sure, then either your ears are not good enough, or what people are playing is too vague. So just because the tune is simple doesn't mean that this is easy, right? So you should also practice those chords. Don't just play the A section and then go to the jam and think you know the tune, right? So I'm just focusing on the A section now because of limits of time limits. I don't want to make a video that's too long. Um, well, anyway, I think that was it. That's my little lesson on sus chords and Maiden Voyage. And yeah, let me know in the comments if you have any questions, and I shall see you next time.